thank you everybody for joining. The participants, you should all have the Q&A and the chat functions live, so please do feel free to use them, whether it's to introduce yourselves or to ask any questions. So thank you all, like I say, for joining. This is the second in a 4-part series that we're hosting, where we're exploring the cost to individuals, to society, and to business when we pay no more than lip service to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Okay, I've already got an issue. I'm going to close the window. I think that's a little bit better. So yeah, when we pay no more than lip service to diversity, equity, and inclusion. For the last event, we focused on women and the impact that the pandemic has had on whether we were talking about the impact of the pandemic, remote working, the lack of progress that we've seen on equal pay over the past few decades. And we looked at the impact of all of these things on individuals, but also on businesses. If you missed that session and you think it would be of research, of use to you, of value to you, we've compiled all of our findings and recommendations into a comprehensive toolbox that you can find on our website. Now, for this event, the event that you have obviously got an interest in, we shine a spotlight on young people in the workforce. And we look at the impact of the past 2 years on social mobility, on inequity, and the broader access that young people have or haven't had to opportunities. And like I say, we're really lucky to be joined by Bright Network. They bring their invaluable insight to both sides of the issue. They have an employee and an employer perspective. As a membership organisation for graduates, they have a unique insight into the needs and challenges that face young people. And as a talent attraction partner to globally recognisable employers, they understand the needs and priorities that companies have. So a quick overview of what we'll be covering in the next hour, a little bit of an introduction to us at Happy Maven. Going into the context, why have we chosen, with the DE&I agenda, with so many conflicting priorities, why have we chosen to focus on young people? Then I will hand over to Johnson from Bright Network for the meat of today's session, bringing their research and insight into the challenges and opportunities that have been presented over the last couple of years and what that means for the future. We will then open the space up for your questions. I'm sure you've got some burning issues. And then we will look at what we can think, what priorities we need to focus on for the future and what individual takeaways we can implement. And please, like I say, do use the Q&A function, do use the chat function. It is a webinar format and we are recording, but if you would like to put your hand up, if you would like to ask your question to camera, I can promote you to a panelist and you can do that, whatever you are comfortable with. So to give you some context, these quarterly events originally started out, like many things, as in-person events. They were specifically aimed at HR leaders. We wanted to convene a space where HR leaders could meet and discuss challenges. Not only were we sharing best practice as to what was happening in the future of work, but it was a place for them to share professional, personal, organizational, industry challenges. But like many things in the last 2 years, this has evolved into something bigger. And these events now exist for anybody that is interested in the people agenda in any way, shape, or form. So these events exist for you. So we welcome feedback and we're open to suggestions for future topics. And I'm also really pleased to announce that for the first time in our history, we now have an impact report, which is live on our website. If you are interested in what a difference we can make in the world of work, please do dig it out or email us and we'll send it to you. So let me first start with, we've said we're going to focus on young people, but if I did a straw poll to everybody on this session, we'd all have very, very different ideas of what we even mean by a young person. So I think that lots of times we use these terms interchangeably. I work with clients who will still be referring to young people as millennials. And of course, some millennials do fit into that category. But you'll notice from this little chart that we've shared, which is already a couple of years old, that for the focus of our conversations, we're looking at young people as they've entered the world of work. So for our discussions at Happy Maven, we tend to think of young people in the age bracket 18 to 30. I'm sure that Johnson will clarify what they refer to as young people. But within your organisations, within your understandings, I'm sure it sits somewhere between Gen Z and millennials. But it's interesting to see that millennials will definitely be decision makers and, you know, within the hierarchy of organisations at some point too. And why, like I say, did we decide to focus on young people when there's so many conflicting priorities at the moment around diversity, equity and inclusion? And of course, age is a protected characteristic in the UK, but when was the last time you actually saw it factored and considered in DE&I investments? Not very often. We sometimes talk about the aging workforce, we talk about the learning and development needs of people who have been in work for a number of years, but we don't actually think of young people as a group. And the reality is that young people cut across so many other elements that are normally considered when we're looking at sex, whether we're looking at ethnicity, whether we're looking at socioeconomic backgrounds. Age cuts across all of these intersections, and different young people will be facing different issues. The one thing that so much research has shown, not just over the last 2 years, but I would say, unfortunately, since the last global recession, that social mobility has been down in general. And of course, the deepest impacts are felt by young people. And over the last couple of years, we'll also find that young people are overrepresented, unfortunately, in the areas that have been most impacted by COVID, the industries in which they work, or whether they're leaving education, etc. And that, unfortunately, has widened existing gaps. So whether that is on pay, whether that's on social mobility, whether that's on access to opportunities. So all of these have been real issues. So before I hand over to Johnson, I'd really like to ask all of you a question. Does your organisation even capture data on age? Would you even be able to answer how your workforce is segmented? Everyone good? Got a couple more still coming in. Interesting. About half is a yes. Okay, thank you. That's great. And actually quite good news. So I'd now, like I say, I'd like to hand over to Johnson Adeyanju. He's the account director at Bright Network, and he'll be sharing research and insight from the past 2 years. Johnson, I know that you and your team have continued to help employers hire bright and diverse talent. But like many of us, your working world looks a lot different than it did when you and I first met a few years ago. I can see from your little profile picture, it's changed a lot. Has this new way of working been a challenge or an opportunity for you?
Do you know what? I think mostly an opportunity. And yeah, firstly, thank you, Suki, for welcoming me. But yeah, I think mostly an opportunity for us at Bright Network. We are very much a digital business. And so actually we found the transition during lockdown to really work to our advantage. And we were in a very strong position to advise our clients, our partners on how to kind of pivot and make that change. So yeah, in the presentation, I'm going to be touching on some of the kind of opportunities that have come out, but certainly from a Bright Network perspective, it's just absolutely kind of catapulted our business forward.
Fantastic. But I bet you missed the in-person events because they
had
great
absolutely.
energy.
Yeah, on a personal level, you know, being an extrovert, it's been pretty tricky, kind of that kind of home environment rather than being in person. But yeah, thank you so much, Suki, for inviting Bright Network to be part of today's really kind of special event. And thank you to everybody for joining. Suki, as you mentioned, social mobility is something that's really important to us, given that we're working with young people. And this is something that diversity is definitely something that they're thinking about a lot more. What I'm going to do is just see if I can share my presentation. Can everybody see that all right? I'm going to assume that that's a yes. So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the kind of challenges that young people have faced as a result of the last 20 months, and then kind of touching on some of the opportunities as well. But before I do that, just to kind of introduce myself. So my name is Johnson. I've worked at Bright Network for about 4 years now, and interestingly, for me, in terms of my journey, I was a client of Bright Networks initially. So I was working in talent acquisition as a D&I lead, and kind of got poached over to the other side. And I was really fascinated by how Bright Network were using data to change the kind of diversity intakes of various companies. And then before that, I was a sixth form teacher, teaching English, Lang and Lit in Hackney. So a very, very different world. But in terms of today's agenda and what I thought I would kind of focus on, firstly, just a very quick intro to Bright Network, just to kind of give you a sense of our position when it comes to students and graduates, those challenges and opportunities, as we say, that have kind of emerged as a result of the pandemic, and then also thinking together about, you know, what the future landscape looks like, and what some of the beneficial things we can kind of take forward, before then joining in Suki for a Q&A with yourselves. So in terms of Bright Network, we've been around for the best part of the last decade, and our mission is all around connecting students and graduates with employers. And I think very early on in our journey, our CEO, James, who's still very much involved in the business, he realized that in order to get the best engagement out of young people, actually we needed to do a lot of work to support them, to kind of upskill them and help them really navigate the world of work. Because if you come from a family, for example, that have never worked in the legal sector, then really navigating how to get into that field could be pretty tricky, for example. And so a big part of what we do is, from the moment students and graduates are going on campus, really wrap ourselves around them as a support system, as a kind of big bro, in terms of developing the cultural capital that they're going to need to then be successful in the various roles that they go into. We often get asked, I think, from employers, especially those who are at the beginning of their journey when it comes to really hiring diverse student and graduate talent, we're often asked, you know, what are the kind of key ingredients to the very best kind of attraction strategy? And I think this sentence really sums it up very nicely, that in order to reach that kind of hard to reach talent, there's three kind of key components. And we've certainly kind of lived by these principles. So the first is to make sure that you're attraction strategy is really personalized. You know, Gen Z and millennials, they expect that kind of personalized experience in everything they do, whether it's shopping, Instagram, whether it's the films that they're watching on Netflix. And in reality, the kind of recruitment thing is the same. We really want to make sure that the messages are personalized around their backgrounds, around their interests. And we use a lot of the data that we collect from our members to do that. The second thing is around making sure that that overall attraction experience is really valuable to members. I've touched on already that kind of upskilling component, but that's something that we have seen pays dividends. Almost like the more you give back to students and graduates in terms of helping them out, the more invested they're going to be in you in terms of being an employer or an employer partner like we are. And then finally, those kind of unforgettable experiences. It is an incredibly competitive world. And as a result of the pandemic, which I'll touch on in a moment, it's really become a candidate-led market this year we're seeing. And so creating those unforgettable experiences where they're going to choose you over another employer and they're not going to renege on your offer is super important. And one of the main ways we find to do that is to have those kind of role models, real models that you can then position and be advocates on your behalf. So every year we conduct multiple surveys across our student and graduate members. Understanding what they want is so important, especially if you're looking to attract and convert diverse talent. And consistently, since I've kind of been in the organization, so 4 years, this has stayed about the same, that 81% of our members want to connect with a company before applying. And by connect, that's meet them at an event, that's attend an insight day, that's have an opportunity to have a coffee chat or have some form of meaningful engagement before they apply. Now, obviously with the pandemic, that was impacted somewhat, but still there were many ways to work around it. And again, I'll touch on some of those. Also, as part of that surveying that we do with our members, some of these other key factors have come out as well. So 95% of our members really think that employers should be in a position to provide them with upskilling as part of that process. 86% expect that kind of application support. If you're telling them to apply to something, they don't want to be set up for failure. They want to have a really clear understanding of what that recruitment process looks like. And in fact, it's one of the top reasons why students and graduates will give up on an application process, is if they think it's just too complex and there's not enough explanation around it. Diversity is so important to these two generations, millennials and Gen Z, and they really want to see employers putting diversity at the forefront of their campaign. And then, as I mentioned before, that kind of desire to meet role models and to be able to at least engage with them, whether that's in person or at least virtually. So just kind of bringing it back again to kind of like our purpose and how I think we've kind of been able to benefit from the last few years in terms of engaging students and graduates. There has been a real shift, I think, over the last decade in terms of how recruitment leaders engage early talent. So traditionally, you had your, sort of 90s job boards that were really static. Companies relied heavily on their brand, and they just, populated jobs on there, and then basically sent every job to everybody and hoped for the best. And I think we've really kind of helped to lead the change away from that to really much more personalized communications, as I mentioned before, where we can be really targeted and we can use data, psychometric information to really target candidates based on their background, based on their interests, and then to have that more multi-channel approach, so that we're offering them more touch points, more opportunities to engage with employers before they apply. So us taking that approach has led us to typically working with about 250 employers each year. And it's also allowed us to develop an incredibly diverse network of talent. So all of those things that I mentioned before, those key ingredients to engaging underrepresented groups, so upskilling, offering that kind of advice and support, the opportunities to meet up as part of the process, clarity around the process, has meant that our membership has very organically grown as a very diverse membership. And it's not actually on there, but the kind of metrics that we use around social mobility and to measure that we're doing well are things like state educated, those who receive free school meals, and we're over-indexing that for that in terms of the national average. And also those who are first generation in their family to go to university. So we use a number of metrics to make sure that our network is representative of those who are typically underrepresented in various recruitment processes. We'll share these slides with you so you'll be able to kind of get a sense of the value add that our members feel as a result of that kind of investment into upskilling and supporting them. So that's a little bit about Bright Network and kind of some of the, hopefully some tips along the way around what you can be doing to really engage diverse talent. Moving on now to some of the key challenges that we felt kind of from our members over the last 20 months. And where we've identified these challenges have been sometimes where we've had programs that are specifically designed for them that have not necessarily gone to plan because of the pandemic, but also from some very specific research that we carried out at multiple points over the last 2 years or so, where we asked our members how they were feeling and we reached out to kind of get a better understanding. So the first thing to say is that the start of the pandemic in particular really knocked the confidence of our members. So kind of as early as March, there was a 33% drop in those feeling confident to secure a graduate role. And that's unsurprising given that many businesses were very quick to kind of, either reduce the number of hires or completely get rid of their graduate scheme altogether. Many businesses were impacted to the point where they're no longer running today. So that confidence, that lack of confidence was definitely felt across our membership. You can see that only 36% of members felt confident also about the virtual application process. So whilst some graduate employers continue to employ young people, they obviously had to pivot to the kind of virtual setting. But lots of students and graduates had never been through those types of processes before. And again, because things were moving so quickly during the pandemic, they just didn't have the time to feel as prepared as they wanted to in terms of taking part in those processes. So that's a little bit in terms of the research that came out. In terms of some key challenges that we identified in that time, firstly, just less easy to network with businesses. We usually run about 20 in-person events with hundreds of students and graduates. And of course, we had to flip those all to virtual. And initially, actually, we just had a hiatus where we didn't do any. So that ability to learn from business leaders about what the expectations are was almost completely stripped away. Fewer opportunities in the market, which I've already touched on. Career fairs obviously being paused during the pandemic. Lots and lots of technical issues. I'm sure many of you on the call felt these as well around kind of setting up virtual assessment centres and moving so quickly as businesses to try and navigate that. The general consensus from our research has been consistent throughout the year that actually young people have not felt too bad about remote working. I think in reality what's been tricky is the practicalities of it. So many young people living in flat shares with just kind of one point of Wi-Fi access, and as you all know, having calls like this and having to be involved in calls where you need quiet around you has proven really tricky for lots of our members, and they certainly fed that back in the research that we commissioned. And again, a really interesting one that came out from our LGBT event that we run, members are basically telling us, and we feeling it through the kind of reduced level of applications for our LGBT event. Actually, they're not necessarily, many of them have not necessarily come out in their home environment. And because of the pandemic, we're now living back at home. And so did not feel as if they could get involved in the same types of LGBT plus activities that they would on campus or whilst at university. And then kind of finally, a kind of key challenge around social mobility. We've done a bit more investigation into this, that actually many of our members were more keen to take on part-time jobs and ad hoc roles, take gaps in their education, or take gaps between getting onto things like internships and stuff, so that they can actually support their overall household income as well. So lots and lots of challenges off of the back of a really, really difficult couple of years, and all shrouded with a real lack of confidence. And I think the biggest result of the dip in confidence was actually students and graduates in particular really scrambling around to apply to as many jobs, as many opportunities as possible. So I'm sure many of you on the call felt it if you hire early talent, that you probably had an insane number of applications across the board in 2020 and in 2021. The kind of flip of that this year is that actually it has kind of settled down, but actually employers are now backfilling for roles that they didn't fill the previous year. So the whole picture has kind of turned on its head, but just to kind of give you the full context of those challenges. So moving on now to some of the opportunities that came out of the pandemic. I think it wasn't all doom and gloom, and I think for organizations that were digitally ready, that were willing to be really empathetic to students and graduates about the difficulties of virtual assessment and things like that, they were actually the real winners, and were able to kind of benefit from some of the things that came out of the pandemic. So the first thing to say is that we, particularly as an organization, have found the virtualization process that happened and the speed at which that happened to be really democratizing. And just to kind of put that into context, so those in-person events that we run each year, will run events like Black Heritage Future Leaders event or Women in Tech event and things like that. We saw 4 to 5 times the number of people being able to get involved in every single event, apart from the kind of LGBT one, which I mentioned before. So that really was proof, I think, to us that actually, whilst running things virtually is not quite the same in terms of that in-person engagement and that in-person networking, it really did allow students and graduates like never before to get stuck in and to benefit from some of the resources that employers were kind of putting forward. The increased access to virtual experiences, events, and internships obviously went up in terms of a social mobility perspective, because travel, accommodation costs and things like that were removed. So those higher numbers we were experiencing were probably because people for the first time could physically or financially access these activities. And I think the big difference is probably revealing of how much of the social mobility agenda wasn't being met before the pandemic. If all of these people were available to get involved and wanted to get involved, but they weren't, it's kind of revealing that that their needs weren't being met. And then finally, increased flexibility with the ability for hybrid and remote working. So lots and lots of feedback that actually, once we kind of got over the pain of moving to a more hybrid way of working or a more virtual way of working, actually, I think lots and lots of people definitely felt the benefits. And we were being asked late last year by our employers whether students and graduates wanted to be in the office full time, or whether they wanted to have a bit of a hybrid approach. So like we always do, we went out to our members to kind of ask them, and you can see from that stat there that actually the vast majority of our members do like the ability to have a bit of both. Obviously, being in the office when they need to be, or when all of their flatmates are in, or whatever, is a nice option to have. But they also do want to have that option to be at home as well. And I think employers that have struck the balance well have kind of had kind of 3 to 4 days in the office, and then 1 to 2 days at home, so that students and graduates are gaining from the osmosis learning that happens in that office environment, but they still have the same flexibility as the rest of the workforce in terms of managing their own lives and things like that. So I mentioned before just how important that virtualization process has been for us as an opportunity, and allowing us to really stretch our reach when it comes to some of those cold spots in the UK, where you have students and graduates who don't readily have access to local resources when it comes to early careers. And testament to that is something that we ran last year and the year before, called Internship Experience UK. Some of you may have even seen this on some of the CVs that you've had coming through from junior talent. But essentially, 3 months into the pandemic, we thought, what can we do to respond to the fact that so many of our members were not going to have the quality internship experience that they would usually have, and were telling us this as well. So we decided to contact our top employer partners, and to put on a virtual internship series across a range of different sectors. It absolutely blew up. The Guardian jumped on it to sponsor it. We were on the BBC quite often as our CEO there, talking about it in the BBC Morning TV. We had around 200,000 applications, and we had around 100,000 members take part in these virtual internships. And in terms of the format, it was so simple for us to do, to essentially have the employers have some speakers from within their business. We worked on these kind of work samples that were really realistic to what that sector and role would do and the kind of practically do. And then we got the students and graduates to peer mark that assessment once they completed it. And as you can just see from the stats at the bottom, in terms of appealing to the most underrepresented groups, this is by far probably one of the single most impactful things that we were able to do. You can see 20% there, Black heritage. Only 15% of our network is Black heritage, so above that reach. 80% state educated as well, and a wide range of different universities. And as an added impact, what we're now getting is a number of employers telling us and asking us for our support around setting up these types of virtual internships themselves. So organizations like Lloyd's wanting to do some in-person kind of internships as they traditionally did, but also for areas where they want to have that bigger reach, where they also want to have that, where they want to kind of also tackle that kind of social mobility challenge, and also tie into their social responsibility around their sector, whether it's banking or whatever. They found that actually doing a virtual internship for the first time themselves next year and this year is going to be a really important part of their overall attraction strategy. So there you have it, some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that have arisen out of lockdown and COVID. Thinking ahead, I think what we're seeing is that there is going to be a much more hybrid approach to accessing talent in early careers and beyond. We've just signed off on all of our events for the coming year being hybrid, so that's already a start. and we're already hearing from kind of employers. We're having lots of discussions. We're about to go out and survey our 250 employers on exactly what hybrid approaches they're going to take, whether that's to the delivery of certain recruitment programs, or whether that's hybrid in terms of how they actually engage students and graduates in the first place. But it's looking like that's definitely the way to go. And I think actually the kind of flexible working that's emerged for students and graduates, business managers, leaders are becoming more and more comfortable that it works, that you can drive results. And it's also leading, I think, to innovation in terms of digital readiness. So yes, you know, being in the office, you can't replace that in terms of being able to learn quickly from others. But actually, does it mean that we need to look at the way in which we use technology to speed up that learning, and development? And lots of the businesses we're working with are now looking into that as an option, and are heavily invested in that kind of digital upskilling as well. So yeah, that's it. Suki, back over to you to kind of take some questions.
Johnson, thank you so much, and thank you for making me feel so optimistic about the future. The way that, you know, you framed it, from the challenges to the opportunities, there's a lot to get excited about. I'd really like to open it up to questions. I've got a couple that have just come in, Johnson. So for young people, I have actually wondered myself with all of the different cohorts for graduating, but Jacob's asked, what do you consider the biggest challenge facing young people joining work?
That's a good question. I think as a kind of Bright Network response, I do think it's around that investment in digital skills. We've just set up Bright Network Technology Academy, which is free of charge, training up those from low socioeconomic backgrounds in to become coders, to become full stack developers, and to be really ready for the kind of digital innovation that's going to be required if we are going to have multiple pandemics, or if the world is going to be flipped on its head again. So I think it's around just making sure that they have the right technical L&D support to make sure that they're ready for the future.
Yeah, and we're seeing that with school children, aren't we? We're seeing that digital divide, and those gaps only get broader, don't they?
Absolutely.
Right, another question for you, Johnson. What employer actions have led to success stories over the last 2 years? Great question.
Yeah, I was speaking before this call, actually, I was just speaking to the person who manages our end-to-end recruitment processes around this. And it sounds maybe a little bit soppy, but actually in relation to the pandemic, some of the best actions have been around displaying empathy. Like I think those organizations that have embedded an empathetic approach to whatever they do, they're the real winners, because students and graduates in particular have been very loyal around that kind of understanding. And I think that goes beyond students and graduates, right? I think we've all been like that as employees, but yeah, that kind of empathetic approach. But also, I think those who have decided to use this as an opportunity to rip up the rule book a little bit, they have also benefited hugely. Again, just before this call, I was speaking to one of the biggest tech businesses in this country, and they were like, how can you help us to rip up the rule book? And what would you say to us doing away with assessment centers altogether? How do you guys feel about that? So there's lots of innovation going on. There's lots of changes going on. I think the organizations that are being bold, empathetic, and are willing to change what they've traditionally done, they have come up as the winners.
And isn't that true across the board? That's exactly what we've seen with our clients in the last 2 years. The ones who have led as human beings, the ones who have been bold in saying, we're just going to reimagine the future of work. So that's absolutely great to hear. Grace has asked a question that I was thinking about when you were talking about some of your survey statistics as to how much young people disclose about their backgrounds. So Grace's question is, as social mobility becomes more prevalent in the DEI agenda, do you think young people are more open to self-identify as coming from a low socioeconomic background?
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, and then sometimes I feel a little bit jaded in my or kind of blurred in my perspective of it, because Bright Network in a way positions itself as a kind of positive action organization, right? And so the student and graduate members we have are much more forthcoming around their very sensitive personal data than you know, if they were to apply for a company directly. So we tend to have really high declaration rates around things like receiving free school meals or coming from a low socioeconomic background. Having said that, I do think that as we seek, and has universities, schools seek to educate students and graduates a lot more on the social mobility agenda, there is that increased comfortability with kind of self-identifying. What challenges that might present I think are still to be seen, because there could be some really obvious challenges if everybody all of a sudden thinks that they kind of fit into those categories. But yeah, I think people are becoming more comfortable with sharing that information.
Or you've created an forum and an environment where they're comfortable sharing it with you,
Yeah.
and the rest of us need to create environments that replicate that, because it's about the trust, isn't it, when people are sharing their backgrounds or any context.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And we have a very kind of clear process that we take our members through in terms of continuously educating them as to why we're using their data and why we want it. And I think it's actually paying off in terms of them saying, fair enough, here you go.
Great. And so with younger people, we know that they are bought into that alignment with values, purpose, etc. But another question that's come in that is very close to my heart, because I had a personal run-in with a HR manager about a decade ago about this topic. But how do you change the mindset, hearts and minds of more traditional HR managers in companies? I remember butting heads with I worked at a global giant, and we had a graduate program, and I wanted, of course, to pay train fares for someone coming for an interview. And I was told by the HR manager that if they had applied, that was their problem. I'm hoping that you get different answers now, Johnson. So how do you change that mindset?
Yeah, I guess in a way, within my role, I'm at the forefront of this, because often I'm working with new organizations who may be not so far ahead with their D&I strategy, and they're having to basically make this internal business case. And I think where I've seen it work really well is actually sometimes conceding to the fact that you can't always do everything straight away. And sometimes you may want to just focus on something very specific where you can measure the results, you can measure the kind of return on your activity, and then present that back to the business as a case for doing more. That seems to have been the general kind of process. So sometimes with an organization, we'll start really, really small, and we'll start with a very specific demographic. And as frustrating as that is, I mean, you almost want to say, let's just change everything straight away. It seems to be one of the more effective ways to change the hearts and minds. Data has such a powerful role to play, I think, in terms of changing the hearts and minds, because it's something tangible that you can take to a board meeting.
I absolutely love that. It echoes everything that we say, because again, when you're brought in, they want to do everything. Let's just do it all. And you're just like, no, can we really define what we're going to work on? Measure.
Yeah.
Yes, I totally get it. I love that. We've got some more questions, but I will come back to your questions if we have time at the end. Otherwise, Johnson and I will answer them offline and to get back to you. So thank you. I'm just conscious of everyone's time. I've got a quick question for all of you, please. Let me, because this would be great to know if your organisation does consider social mobility as a factor in its agenda. Oh, great responses, but maybe that's reflective of the people who are on the call for the yes.
Yeah, we're probably preaching to the converted.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, there's definitely more yeses, but there are some no's. So that's very good to know. Thank you for sharing. So Johnson, I'd like you to stay on screen as we
Sure.
move on to, you know, what the future holds. And I'd love your perspectives on what we think at Happy Maven, but the lens that you bring is absolutely invaluable. So, you know, for the months, years ahead, when we all went into this in March 2020, even the more pessimistic of us certainly didn't envisage that 2 years on we would still be facing the pandemic, would still be facing these altered ways of living, working, going to school. And I would imagine that now with the repercussions that will continue. So when we look at it from an employer perspective, or we look at it from the lens of a young person, you know, we certainly see that this is not going to be an overnight fix. As I said earlier, you know, young people are predominantly in the sectors that have been the slowest to recover. Is this your experience as well, Johnson?
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the jobs that I guess had to go first, yeah, definitely there's an overlap there.
And do you see that I know that with Bright Network, you've always focused on the upskilling, but do you think as well as the widening inequity, the skills gap is as broadened?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the decision that we took a couple of years ago to invest in Bright Network Technology Academy, was an understanding that we're doing lots around the kind of soft skills, but what's creating the gulf is the gap around the hard skills, like between different groups and the accessibility. So even with the Technology Academy, for example, we've taken the decision not to include any exit fees. So we'll train them and then we don't ask them to pay back or anything like that. They don't have to pay to do it. And those are really bold moves that we've taken that are like, what? And expensive, but it's so that, as you say, we can kind of stop this skills gap from getting much wider.
You've put your money where your heart is. That's absolutely fantastic. And there is so much evidence from, you know, previous crises that if young people have a rocky start at the beginning, it puts them, you know, at a lower wage expectation, possibly for the rest of their lives. So if you're plugging that right at the beginning, you're setting them up for the next 40, 50 years. Because, sorry, young people on the call, that's how long you'll be working for. And the other thing that we both know is that the ESG and the CSR agenda is here to stay. Do you find clients talking about ESG more and more?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I touched on it before, but actually what I'm starting to notice a lot from the employers that we work with is more collaborative thinking around how they can almost use their early careers recruitment to kind of focus on some of these agendas that they have, and to kind of tie multiple pots of budget together. So yeah, there's definitely more synergy, I think, than ever.
And the more that I always think that the more they interlink it, the less likely they are to jettison one individual piece.
Yeah.
It's when everything's bolted on at the end, it's the first thing to go, but the more they can see the links, the stronger it will be.
Yeah, I think what's really nice that's come out of the CSR stuff as well is an understanding that young people, when it comes to the world of work, really ought to start very early on. So then that kind of early intervention piece. And I think CSR gets that a bit more. So you'll see, you know, CSR agenda to go into primary schools and things like that. But actually, it kind of almost needs to happen on the kind of recruitment side of things as well.
Yeah, we see that with our tech clients, especially in places like Israel. They are right, you know, they are in the primary schools, nurturing that talent. And I think that the one thing you and I can absolutely agree on, that, you know, younger job seekers, that whole diversity, inclusion, alignment to values is not going anywhere.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it's been really interesting this year in order to kind of stop students and graduates from reneging on offers. Some firms have said, okay, we'll add in, you know, or we'll bring back that kind of signing bonus. And I think a real testament to how, you know, mission and value aligned this generation are. Lots of them have been like, it doesn't matter about the signing bonus, I still don't want to join your organization. So I think it, you know, it goes to show that they're not just about money, that they actually really do care about the things that they say that they care about, which is really cool.
And we're a small organization. We've seen that when we've interviewed the questions that young people will ask us. And I think it is, you know, it's not an either or, it drives us to be better. So, you know, for employers on the call, don't look at this as something that you're having to give, you're having to relinquish. Think that it's actually, you know, improving your DEI agenda, your ESG agenda. It's driving those commitments up. And the one thing that I always like to say is, you know, we think of the protected characteristics, we think about social mobility, we think about socioeconomics, we think of young people, we think of these as underrepresented groups. That's the language that we use. But what if we reframed that as underestimated talent? This is a pool of underutilized talent that we can reach. And, you know, that's what you do for a living, Johnson.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful reframe. I'll actually have to kind of write that down and share that with the team. I think that's a really useful reframe.
Thank you. And what we both said earlier, you know, the companies that have done the best in the last couple of years, who have come out of this the strongest, are the ones that haven't been scared of resetting, of reimagining the world of work. You know, how many of us 2 years ago were, our whole businesses on, you know, would be online. So I definitely think that can continue.
Definitely. And it's so telling. It's almost as if some businesses during the pandemic had done their research on previous pandemics, and they decided to really keep the gears on, you know, rather than stop activity. And we've just been looking at that report, and those organizations, they're not struggling at the moment in terms of their hires, whereas the ones that really shut down everything, shut down that kind of engagement investment, they're having to pivot so quickly to try and catch up.
Well, it's great to hear that you're so busy. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ignore the next poll question. And Johnson, this is where we really do need your expertise. For everybody that's on the call, for when we share the toolbox with other HR leaders, what difference can we all make? You know, what can we on this call do? That one of the first things that, you know, that I absolutely have to congratulate you on is your virtual internships, and then ask the question, are they paid or unpaid?
The virtual internships are unpaid, but in the way that they work is that they're not actually doing any work for the organizations. So it's purely an upskilling kind of element for themselves. So there's no expectation for them to be contributing to the business in any way. That makes
Great.
sense.
Well, in that case, I've got to preface my first little square that goes up, which says no unpaid internships, but obviously depends upon what the skill, what the exchange actually is.
Yeah.
The whole contextual recruitment, as you've already said, Johnson, the relationship starts way before an application.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for all of the campaigns that we work on, we talk about creating equity at every stage of the recruitment process. And in order to do that best, I guess it's not necessarily focusing on one particular demographic and their context, but being responsive enough, making your process responsive enough for an individual to say, actually, this isn't quite right for me, and being able to adapt that.
Great. And we always think with young people about the support that we can give them and what we can teach them. There is more than place, even in this hybrid and virtual world, for the untold benefits of reverse mentoring.
Yeah, absolutely. The virtualization that's happened in the last few years has led to such an increase when it comes to employers having a mentoring element to their overall attraction strategy. So we've had a couple of organizations have their internal diversity networks come on and do kind of virtual mentoring webinars with, fairly sizable groups of students who've already entered into their application process. And the effect that that's had on improved conversion rate has just been phenomenal, because members are feeling so much more invested in that process, because they're getting to speak to somebody who looks like them within the business, and they're getting some tips and tricks to really understand the sector as well. So yeah, there's huge potential to develop the mentoring piece.
Great. And don't be scared of the data.
Yeah, data literally underpins everything that we do at Bright Network, whether that's declared data we're collecting or behavioral data. And we've become pretty obsessed with just the endless benefits that having that data in the first place can have. Even if that data is quote unquote negative or not quite what you want, it's so helpful to be able to access it.
Yeah, and this is what we say, to clients, that if you can't measure it, how do you know what it is that you're trying to change, and how do you know that you've made a difference? So please don't be scared of the data, even if you need to look at it through clenched fingers. The more that we can embed inclusive practices, as Johnson said, and as we've learned from our experience, that the leaders that have really come out strongest are the ones that led with their hearts, led with authenticity, with vulnerability. And if we can embed those inclusive practices, not just within, hiring practices, recruitment, onboarding, but once people are working with us, what are we doing for mental health support? What are we doing to make sure that people are logging off on time? The example that you gave, Johnson, about the LBGT network, which it would never have occurred to me.
Yeah, and I think it was a learning curve for us as well. And it's definitely kind of led us to think a bit more about how we make sure that we're fully inclusive for that community and supportive as well. Yeah,
which leads me to my last and final point. Collective intelligence. Consult your people. Those perspectives are there, that sometimes we think that we're doing the right thing, but we just haven't, discussed it with the group or sought those different perspectives.
Yeah, 100%. And also they are just the biggest advocates you can have, because we have the data on this. We know that when we write up content and success stories on individuals who are already working within an organization, that is the most consumed content across our platform. It's all that the next generation care about. They want to be like those people. And so using your people and creating role models from your people is so, so important.
Well, on that note, Johnson, thank you so much for not just your time today, but your energy. I know that you've been a little bit under the weather, so it's even more appreciated. But the insight and the energy that you've just brought to this discussion, we will share your contact details and Bright Network's contact details with everyone who registered for the event. And thank you all for attending. We will send out the deck and Bright Networks. We will, like I say, share their contact details. If you're interested in any of our toolboxes or our impact report, they're all for free on the website. And we really do look forward to seeing you at our next event in May, where it'll be for Mental Health Awareness Week, and we'll be looking at mental health through the lens of race. So it should be a very, very interesting session. Johnson, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.